war, the Normans were ruthless and powerful. Their strength and their clever tactics made them very hard to fight. A Norman army would be made up of knights, who would be from the upper classes of society. They would fight on horseback. They would be fully trained, full-time soldiers. The army also had archers, usually on foot, and other foot soldiers. They had good protection. Their entire body was covered in a chain-mail tunic. They would have had iron shields and helmets to block enemy swords. The knights usually carried a lance. They would have had high saddles and long stirrups, allowing them to stand as they rode, and perhaps more importantly, stopped them from falling off when they struck an opponent. The lances, combined with the speed of the horses, made the knights on horseback like tanks charging into the enemy. The archers would make their arrows rain down on their opponents, allowing the knights to break through the weakened defenses. The Normans divided themselves into small fighting units called a conroy, and these groups would belong to a larger group called a bataille. These groups were able to make controlled attacks and then turn as if to flee. They would be chased by a group of the enemy, who would then find themselves cut off from the main army, and gradually the Normans would divide up and defeat their enemies. The Normans were regularly at war, either in Holy Crusades or their battles in Western Europe, and the knowledge learned through warfare was used to continually update their armor and tactics. Before the Normans came to Ireland, there were constant raids and counter-raids between the warring Gaelic families. When the Normans first arrived in Ireland, it is no wonder that these highly skilled, powerful soldiers overcame the disorganized Irish warriors dressed in linen tunics, fighting with axes, short swords, spears, and slings. The Normans had knights with stirrups, Flemish crossbowmen, and Welsh longbowmen, and the Irish could not get close enough to hurl their darts and spears. The Normans, as they had done in other parts of Europe, generally brought peace and order to an area once they had conquered it. To do this, they had to keep control. To keep control, they had to be safe. They did as they had done in England. They built what are called motte and baileys. A motte is a mound of earth, maybe 20 to 40 feet high, with ditches around it and a flat top, anywhere between 30 and 100 feet in diameter. Around the top, they built a palisade, or fence, made from interwoven hazel sticks, sometimes called a wattle fence. On the motte, they built a timber tower, a safe place for the ruler to live. A bailey was a smaller mound again, with steep sides connected to the motte by a drawbridge. On the bailey were huts where the soldiers slept, the kitchens, and a place for the animals. Again, around the base was a ditch. In some parts of the world it would have been filled with water, but probably not so in Ireland. It seems like quite a simple fortress, but the motte and bailey would have been carefully built so it didn't collapse under its own weight. In the motte, the Normans were usually safe from attackers. The enemy would have to run up the steep sides, which slowed them down and made them tired, so they could easily be chopped down by the awaiting soldiers. If they got into the bailey, the soldiers would retreat to the motte and fight off their opponents from there. The motte was a good vantage point. From there, the Normans could view the surrounding countryside and be on the lookout for trouble. Nobody could catch them unawares. If you live in County Antrim or County Down, there may be a motte near you. In Ireland, though, there aren't many mottes that also have baileys. And the mottes won't have the buildings on them like we've just seen. But the massive earthworks will still give a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. Obviously, if the Normans were to settle, they had to build more permanent defences. And so, they set about building longer-lasting strongholds, like the castle here, at Carrickfergus. Carrickfergus is built over a well. During a siege, a constant supply of fresh water was vital. The castle is built on a basalt rock, and most of the stone used in the construction of the castle would have been gathered nearby. The Normans also used red sandstone brought in from Whiteabbey, and the light stone used around the windows is limestone, ferried across the loch from Cultraw. It would have been soft and easy to carve. The Normans certainly knew how to use their resources effectively. Look at the number of different types of stone used in the wall. Carrick Castle was built in different stages. The inner ward, or area, where the keep is, was built by John de Courcy in 1178 and took 17 years to complete. The middle ward, which is now in ruins, was built between 1216 and 1223 by Hugh de Lacy. And the outer ward, where the main gate is now, was built between 1226 and 1242. Over the centuries, there have been many changes to the castle to adapt to changes in warfare. Take a look around a Norman castle, and there are plenty of clues about Norman life. This was the toilet. The waste went down the chute and straight out to sea. So much for the environment. At the main entrance to the castle is a gate called a portcullis. If a stranger or an attacking force was seen to be approaching, the guards would wind down the portcullis and block the entrance to the castle. If it was a sudden attack, they could use the axe to chop through the rope and instantly drop the barrier. They would have dropped a second portcullis behind the visitors. Although there isn't one here now, you can still see the grooves. If the strangers were enemies, they could be either speared from a hole above them, called a murder hole, or have hot tar or slops poured on them. If you weren't welcome, you wouldn't get in through the front door. Around the entrance to the castle, you can see deep grooves in the sandstone arches. This is where the castle defenders would sharpen their swords and spears. If you view a spiral staircase in a Norman castle from above, it will always descend in an anti-clockwise direction. This is no accident. Most people are right-handed, so if you're defending the keep, you've plenty of room to swing your sword. But if you're trying to get in, you have problems. If you were a left-handed Norman, I don't think you would have lasted too long. The Normans also put in trick steps, slightly higher than the others. They knew where they were, but the attackers didn't, and often tripped and fell to their death. Once the Normans had established themselves as rulers, they then established their churches in thanks to God and as a demonstration of orderly life. The Normans built magnificent abbeys and cathedrals throughout Ireland and welcomed new religious orders into the country. Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians and Carmelite orders dedicated to preaching and making religion accessible and popular with the people. Wherever the Normans went, they established centres for the monks, often on sites they had previously demolished. The Normans, after all, felt they were God's warriors. Shot Norman. After building castles and churches, houses for the officers and workshops, towns were established. Sometimes towns would be walled in, not only to make them more secure, but also as a status symbol. A clear demonstration of where the countryside ended and the town began. If the town was walled, a gatehouse would usually be the only official entrance to the town. The Gaelic Irish were allowed in to pay taxes or to bring livestock on market days, but they had to pay a toll if they were to trade. At sunup, the gates would open and the town would come to life. The typical Norman town had a main street, which was also a marketplace, and often had a cross where public announcements were made, providing the main source of information for the locals. There were no newspapers in those days. It was also the place where executions and public floggings were carried out. Most people living in the town were merchants, craft workers, and labourers. Merchants could bring in a variety of fine wines from France and Spain, spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, pepper and mace from the Holy Lands, and new materials from the East, such as silk. The merchants could ship in raw materials and export local produce, such as wool and salted fish. The risk of loss through piracy and shipwreck were great, but the profits could be great too. Most craft work took years to develop, and the skills were passed on through the family. The different trades were essential to the development of the town. The blacksmith was perhaps the most important, not only in keeping horses shod and so keeping the owners mobile, but also in making tools necessary for farming or other craft work. The butcher would supply the town with its beef, mutton and pork. Calves' heads, pigs' feet, offal, tripe and game were popular. The leather worker would get the raw hides from the butcher, tan them in pits with oak bark and make a range of leatherware. The general merchant would sell all the spices that were popular in Norman kitchens. Like we have Christmas and the Americans have Thanksgiving, the Normans also had feast days. The feast took place in the great hall of the castle. The lord and his important guests sat at a table on a raised platform called a dais. The other guests sat at long tables. Because they didn't use forks, although the Normans did bring them back from the Holy Lands, the food was either mushy, so you could scoop it up with bread, or cut into pieces to be eaten with the fingers. So far, the only place a Norman pottery has been found in Ulster is Downpatrick, so most plates and mugs were shipped in from Bristol. The food would take hours to prepare and would be quite spicy. Before the meal, the salt boat would be passed round, so you could help yourself to whatever salt you needed. Most townspeople's diets were quite simple. The milk from cows, sheep and goats provided a variety of dairy produce. Bread was one of the basic foods. Some towns had bakers, but most families baked their own. In Ulster, oatmeal was eaten quite a lot too. The better-off Normans might have had a diet like this. For breakfast, they would probably eat bread, butter, cheese, eggs and milk. Lunch would start with soup, or potage, usually made from cabbage, onion, garlic and lettuce. Remember, there were no potatoes in Europe at the time. The main course would be fish or meat. The church did not allow the eating of meat on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays, so for half the week the diet was fish and dairy products. Sweet dishes included the use of whatever fruits were in season and honey. There wasn't tea or coffee then, so you had to drink milk or ale, mead or wine if you had the money. The clothes people wore showed how important or rich they were. Most clothes were made of wool and linen. Peasants wore rough tunics and leggings and leather belts and shoes, if they could afford them. Most women and some men wore hoods. The development of trade saw new materials being used, and the wealthy would wear clothes of great finery, perhaps even fur-lined. Chess was introduced to Europe in the 9th century and was Chinese in origin. The Normans played it as well as draughts and dice, but their favourite pastime took place in the open air. Hunting with dogs and hawks was particularly enjoyed, as was archery, blind man's buff, and bowling. Music was enjoyed at most social gatherings, and jugglers and puppeteers might also perform. Jousting, however, where knights tested each other's might, never really developed as much in Ireland as it did in England and France. The Normans didn't conquer all of Ireland, but the lands in which they took control developed, and the towns are still there today. Dromore, Grey Abbey, Coleraine were all Norman developments. Many of our names are Norman too. Fitz is a Norman word meaning son of, and you only need to look through the phone book to see names of Norman origin still in use today. Although the Normans never conquered Ireland fully, they did freely intermarry with the Irish. They adopted Irish dress, music, language and customs. This was a problem for the English crown, as it could not take control. By the 15th century, the only area of Ireland that was governed by the English was an area around Dublin known as the Pale and a few coastal towns.